Welcome! And today I'm going to show you how I made this cheese cutting board out of this beautiful dark walnut and maple hardwoods. Now this is going to be a Christmas present for my brother's wife, my sister-in-law, because when I was just starting my business a few months ago, she really helped me along the entire process. Now she's told me that she's always wanted one of these cheese cutting boards, so in order to show my appreciation to her, I wanted to make her one. Now if you've seen any of my videos, you know that I like to do things the hard way, but I usually get the results that I want in the end. If you have seen any of my videos and like them, please subscribe to the channel, like the videos, because it really helps me out to grow. You guys know, you know the drill, all right? So, with all that said, let's just go ahead and jump right into it.
So I've had this piece of maple for a while, and it's developed a little bit of a twist, but this can easily be removed by running it through my jointer a few times, taking just a very small amount off at a time and running it through multiple times. Then, making sure that my fence is square, I make one edge perfectly square to the face that I just made flat. With my flat face facing down to be used as a reference, now I can send it through the planer to make the other face perfectly parallel to the jointed face. And again, taking the material off in small increments. Removing the material in small increments not only gives me a better finish, but it also helps keep my blades sharper longer, especially when using a lot of hardwoods. Then with my jointed edge against my fence, I run it through my table saw to square up the final edge. And now I have a perfectly square and usable stock. This next step has no right or wrong way to complete, to be perfectly honest, because this board does not have symmetry, so I'm purposely ripping my stock down into randomly sized strips, anywhere from around a 1/4 inch up to about an inch. But you can literally do any sizes that you want. I'm doing this for both my maple and my walnut stock. Once I have all of my randomly sized strips cut, I'm going to use this template that I made to just give me a visual reference of what the final board should resemble. Now my brain typically only runs on about 1/3 of its horsepower, so I usually need to have my vision on paper or I will forget what I'm making halfway through, and this could have easily turned into a birdhouse for all I know. But you can see that I'm just randomly choosing strips that seem to look good in the moment, and then I'm marking one side where I will make my cuts to trim each piece down, making sure that I keep enough overhang on the other side so that my template will fit within my material. You can see that I've cut the first set of strips, and you'll see why I did this in just a little bit. But with one half of the board done, I'm going to do the exact same process for the other half of the board, and you can also somewhat see that I'm using an old school crosscut box and a handsaw, because if you have ever tried to cut small pieces like these strips on the miter saw, there's a huge tendency for the saw to rip the piece out of your hand and just tear the material up if you don't have a miter sled. And I don't have a miter sled yet. So maybe that will be a future video someday. But for now, once I have all of my pieces set in place and cut down to size, I'm going to number my pieces in order from top to bottom for both sides of the board. I do this because I just spent a bunch of time laying them out, and I don't want to accidentally mess up my order while I'm gluing them together. And though that may seem a little odd, trust me, I've done worse things in the past. Now I can start gluing everything together. I have to do essentially 3 separate glue ups to get this board together. And you can see why I marked one side and cut each piece to line up with each other, because I needed at least one side to, well, line up with each other for the glue up. This way I can make sure I will have the right size material to cut the final board size out of. At the beginning of this video, I said I like to do things the hard way, but this is not actually true. I just don't know the best way to do these things yet in most cases. I had a feeling I was going to have much trouble with this side of the board because I didn't really have a good way to clamp these pieces together since they were so short. And I was proven to be completely correct. But at this point, my glue was already starting to set, so I had no choice other than to just deal with this issue later. After letting the glue dry overnight, I came back out to take all the clamps off. and face that issue that I was talking about. Yeah, kids can play teeter-totter on that piece. But I already knew this was going to be a problem, and I can easily fix this with my jointer. I really love this tool. If you don't have one, this tool has been invaluable. Do not get anything smaller than an 8-inch jointer though. I will leave a link in the description for this 8-inch Wen jointer that I have. With my 2 board pieces flat again, I use my sled to clean up the 2 mating edges of the boards where they will be glued together to its final form. And the reason I don't use my jointer for this is so that I can make sure that the 2 pieces remain perpendicular to each other. Now that both edges are cleaned up, I have a super tight seam that is nearly invisible. And now I can glue up the 3rd and final part of this board. This time it's much easier to clamp these pieces together because I have more surface area that is more spread out. A quick little check with my combination square, this thing is actually perfectly flat. Who would have thought? Certainly not me. The next day comes, I can take off the clamps, check the one side with my combo square just to make sure, and it's still perfectly flat. Am I a real woodworker yet? All terrible jokes aside, I can now lay my template over my material and pray that I have enough material to get my intended board size out of, which, by the way, I've gone with a board size of 6 3/4 by 10 inches. I use my template to mark all 4 corners, then I just verify with my tape measure that I am at least within a 1/16 of my goal, as I'm more concerned with the board coming out square rather than being 100% accurate to the size. With my lines drawn out, I'm going to use my sled because it's just so much easier and safer because I can clamp the material to the sled. And once I get that first side cut, then I can use it against the fence of my sled and cut the rest of the sides just like I would with any other material. Now comes the part I had no idea how to do. This cutter kit didn't come with any instructions or measurements, so I'm honestly just sort of winging it here. After placing the pivot arm roughly where I think it needs to be, I'm just marking for the hole that I need to drill for the arm to go into. With my hole placement marked, I use this shoulder square to accurately transfer my marks to the side of the board for my hole. And I'll leave a link in the description for this square that I'm using if you're interested. Now I'm trying to mark for the center between my lines and the width of the board so that I can make sure I drill perfectly in the center of the board. Otherwise, I've just made some really beautiful firewood, and I have no use for firewood because I live in Phoenix and we are the firewood. After spending all that time making sure to find the center of the board, I remembered I have this self-centering drill jig from Harbor Freight. It's like $30 and totally worth it. You just line up the line on the jig to the line you've made on your project, and that line on the jig is the center of your hole. The jig comes with different size collars for different hole sizes, and I'm going to use the 1/4 inch collar to drill a 1/4 inch hole because the pivot arm is just slightly smaller than 1/4 inch. But my issue is that I don't have a long enough drill bit for this pivot arm. So I've just barely set my bit in the chuck, which is not ideal because the bit wobbles slightly from not having a good grip in the chuck. And you can see here that even still, the hole isn't quite as deep as I'd like it to be. I want the hole to be just a little bit deeper. But that's an issue I'll deal with later. For now, I want to figure out where I need to cut my relief line for the cutting wire to rest so that the cutter can, well, cut the cheese. Get it? Cut the cheese. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's get back on track. After marking where I need to make my cut for the wire, I forgot to hit record and already made my cut. But all you have to do is set your blade height to be halfway through the hole that you've already drilled. Do not cut through the entire board. Then you just line up your mark to the center of your blade, turn on your saw, and confidently push through your cut. Now it's time to deal with that hole issue. So I realized it's actually smaller at the end of the arm, which means I'm thinking I can use a masonry bit. Now, I know this is not the correct bit by any means, but it's the only bit that I have that is long enough, and since I just need the hole slightly deeper, I think this is gonna work in a pinch. So I wanna make sure I don't drill too deep because I don't want the ability for the pivot arm to catch or snag on the side of the board. So I'm just marking my depth with some tape just to make sure I don't go too far. Now I can test fit the whole cutter and see where I need to make any adjustments. Installing the cutter is simply just sliding the arm through the wire in the relief cut, then screwing the tensioning knob, which is also your handle. You can see here that the wire sometimes hits the board, so the easiest way to fix that is to just widen the relief cut slightly. Now I'm not going to take much material off, just about another 1/16 of an inch should work just fine. So I want to make sure that I set my blade height to halfway through my hole again, then really take my time to line up the cut properly, and then just hope for the best, I suppose. After getting the cutter working as intended, it's time to move on to everyone's favorite part, sanding. Luckily for me, my planer does a great job, so I'm just sanding both sides with 100, then 150, then 180 grit paper, and that's all you need for an oil finish. I want to round my corners, so I'm using this top from a water bottle to trace my radiuses. Or radii? I don't know. I'm making my corners rounded so that I can go over to my bandsaw with the wrong size blade on it just to trim off the fat. You could do this with a router and a flush trim bit, but I was lazy and didn't want to set all of that up. Then I use my oscillating belt sander to shape my corners as close to my lines as possible. And once that's done, I will dial in my final smoothness around my corners by hand with some 220 grit paper. My original plan was to round over both the top and the bottom edges with a 1/4 inch roundover bit, but after rounding over just the bottom side of the board and giving it a quick glance, I ended up deciding that I actually really liked the look of the more squared off top edge and having just the roundover on the bottom edge of the board. So instead of rounding over the top edge, I'm just going to soften it with some 220 grit paper, making sure to also soften the edges of the relief cut as well. Then I will do one more final light sand by hand over the entire board. I almost forgot a critical last step. Before you oil, you want to wipe the board with a damp cloth and let it dry. This will cause the wood fibers to raise up, then you want to sand it again with your final grit. If you don't do this, when you go to wash or wipe down your board, you will feel those fibers, so we want to remove them beforehand. I do this step at least twice, sometimes 3 or 4 times, it just depends on if you can still feel those fibers or not. Finally, I have reached the most satisfying step to making this board. I need to make sure this board is food safe, so I'm using mineral oil as my finish. I know there are some who debate what you should use for food safe boards, but it's widely known that mineral oil is a great and safe option. This is just an overpriced bottle of plain mineral oil from the big box store, but I actually just buy a gallon at a time online and refill my bottle as needed. you can definitely save some money by buying a natural plain mineral oil online, and I'll leave a link in the description below of what I actually use. Some people will actually fully submerge their boards in the oil and let it soak in, but I personally feel like that is totally overkill, and it will cause your board to sweat oil for weeks, especially if the board is set in direct sunlight or just in a warm area in general. So I just rub a liberal amount over the entire board with my hands because it's just so much fun to watch the natural colors of the wood come to life. Then I will leave the excess to soak into the board for about an hour or two. Then I will come back and see if the excess has fully absorbed into the board. And if so, then I will do a second application and let that sit again for at least an hour or two. Generally, unless you have a really thick board, I've never needed more than 2 applications of the oil. And it's completely fine to leave that second application to sit overnight, and some may even recommend always doing it that way if possible. Once the second application has sat, that's when I will thoroughly wipe off any of the excess oil that did not absorb into the board. Now that the board has been fully oiled, there's one more step I like to do. This is my handmade Black Cactus board butter. I make this myself right here in my shop. It's completely food safe with only 2 ingredients. It's made to condition new and old boards and other utensils and provide a protective layer to prevent drying out and splitting. And it's available right now at blackcactuswoodwork.com. It's super easy to apply. Just buff a small amount across the entire piece, let it sit for a few minutes, then wipe it off with a clean rag. And you only need 1 application, and you should reapply it about every 3 to 5 washes. I can finally finish the board by installing the cutter. You just take the end loop of the wire and hold it in place lined up with the hole. Then you take the pivot arm, push it through the hole, and guide the end through the loop in the wire. Then you slide the other end into the arm and screw the handle on, which also provides the tension for the wire to cut the cheese. And just like that, it's done. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I think my sister-in-law is going to love it. If you stuck around till the end of the video, I really appreciate it, and I hope maybe you learned enough to try to make your own cheese board. If you could give the video a like, I would truly appreciate it, and if you want to help support this channel, hitting the subscribe button is completely free. Thank you so much, and check out my last video because I made a custom cabinet for a farmhouse style sink, and I made some big mistakes during the build. God bless, and I hope to see you next time.